Imagine a world without streetlights, where the gas lamps flicker in the night and cast long shadows over the cobblestone streets. The air is thick with the stench of poverty and despair, and danger lurks around every corner. Whitechapel is a place where the desperate and the destitute struggle to survive, and where violence and crime are an everyday occurrence. Welcome to the dark streets of Victorian London, where fear and terror grip the city. In the early hours of the 31st of August 1888, the infamous Jack the Ripper claimed his first victim. It's in this deadly and terrifying world that Polly Nichols met her gruesome end. Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly, was a woman born on 26th of August 1845 in Soho, London. She came from a large family and had 6 siblings. Nichols lived a difficult life and struggled with alcoholism, which led to her being separated from her husband and children. In the years leading up to her death, Nichols became destitute and spent much of her time sleeping rough on the streets of London or within the local common lodging houses. She turned to prostitution to survive and was often seen in the Whitechapel area, where she would try to make a living by selling her body for just a few pence. Undoubtedly, this is what she had been doing on the night she died, especially since it later transpired that she'd been turned away from her doss house for failing to provide the sum of 4pence for her bed, stating she would have the money as she had a jolly bonnet. Looking back, it was ascertained that she may have spent the money on alcohol, as she had been seen leaving the Frying Pan pub on Brick Lane beforehand. Sadly, Mary Ann Nichols met her tragic end. Her body was found on Bucks Row, now Durwood Street, in Whitechapel, with her throat cut and her abdomen mutilated. Her death shocked the nation and marked the beginning of one of the most infamous and terrifying killing sprees in history. This is where our story begins. The most crucial aspect when it comes to naming a suspect in the hunt for the elusive yet legendary Jack the Ripper is placing that person at the scene of the crime at around the same time that the murder was taking place. In this respect, several eyewitnesses who found the bodies of the various victims throughout 1888 have been put forward as contenders for having been Jack the Ripper over the years. One suspect in particular, who has found himself high up on this list, is Charles Lechmere, a 39-year-old carman who worked for Pickford's as a meat deliverer. However, if you want to search the contemporary records on the case, you won't find any mention of him. He remains elusive. That is because, in the police and newspaper press reports at the time of the murders, he was referred to as Charles Cross, and he is best known as the man who found the body of Mary Ann Nichols at approximately 3:40 in the morning. According to the account of what happened that morning, Charles Cross was on his way to work from his home at 22 Doveton Street, a convenient short 6-minute walk away from the crime scene, when he noticed something lying in a gateway on Bucks Row whilst walking along the right-hand edge. Believing it to be a tarpaulin, he went to inspect, but stopped in his tracks when he saw that it was in fact a woman lying on her back. He inspected her and then moved back and stood in the middle of the road, as he could hear footsteps approaching from the direction he had just come from, and on turning he saw another man, Robert Paul, 40 yards away, walking towards him on his way to work. Paul was unsure of the man in the middle of the road and went to give him space. However, Cross stopped him and told him to come and look at the woman. Together they approached the prone form and stooped down to see if they could detect any signs of life. They couldn't, although Robert Paul, upon touching her chest, thought he did feel a slight movement and suggested that she might still be yet alive. Paul motioned that they sit the woman up, but Charles Cross didn't want to touch her. At this point they both said that they were running late for work, so they pulled the woman's raised dress down over her knees and continued on their way, agreeing that they would tell the first policeman they encountered. Continuing along Bucks Row, they turned right at its top and headed along what was then Baker's Row. Not long after they encountered Police Constable Jonas Misen, who was engaged in knocking people up. That is, waking those who had to be at work early for the day. According to Police Constable Misen, Cross did all the talking and told him that he was wanted by another policeman in Bucks Row, where there was a woman lying on her back, either drunk or dead. However, at the subsequent inquest, Charles Cross was adamant that he had not mentioned another police officer being present in Bucks Row because he hadn't seen one there. Whatever was said, once Cross and Paul had informed Maizen about the woman, they continued on their way to their respective places of work, Cross following Paul once more and then onto his own place of work at Pickford. Shortly after Cross and Paul had left the gateway in which the woman was lying, Police Constable Neal had entered once again into Bucks Row on his beat. Aided by advantage of a lantern, he noticed Polly's body lying in the street. He was able to see that she had obviously been murdered, and he raised the alarm by whistling, informing another constable to fetch an ambulance and fetch the doctor. As a consequence of this, the majority of the newspapers over the next few days informed their readers incorrectly that it was indeed Constable Neal who had discovered the body. Indeed, he was even called as a witness on the first day of the inquest into her death, Saturday the 1st of September, suggesting that the initial official belief was also that he had been the finder of the body. However, by this time several newspapers were reporting that two men had in fact found the body on their way to work, and over the course of the weekend, Cross was identified as the finder due to the fact that Paul had given a report in the papers naming him as the other eyewitness, with the result that at some stage over the next couple of days he received a coroner's summons to appear as a witness on the second day of the inquest into the death of Mary Ann Nichols, which was due to take place on Monday the 3rd of September. At the inquest on the Monday, he was the last witness to give evidence before the lunch break, appearing directly after P.C. Maizen. Cross's testimony to the inquest revealed very little, although he did contradict Maizen's testimony about him saying another officer wanted him in Bucks Row. Once his testimony was given, he was never looked at again, never questioned again, and vanished into the streets of London once more. Just to recap, Charles Cross was the local carman, or carter, who, whilst on his way to work at around 3:40 in the morning on August 31st, 1888, passed along Bucks Row and had the misfortune to stumble upon the body of Mary Nichols, the woman who is generally accepted as having been the first victim. Or at least, that is the story he told police and what he stated at the inquest. Truly convincing he must have been too, since the police, the coroner, Wynne Baxter, the jury at the inquest and the newspapers, not to mention modern-day sleuths and ripperologists over the years, have been content to accept his version of events. The consensus has always been that Cross had the misfortune to stumble upon the body of Jack the Ripper's first victim as he made his way to work, and that is where his involvement in the case ended. Or did it? Over time, many people have tried to attribute Cross to not only the first murder but also the subsequent ones too, and for these, potentially attributing reasons. Cross lived and worked in the very area that the Jack the Ripper murders took place. With Polly's death, not only was he actually in the area at the time, but he was also walking towards the very location where the murder occurred, more or less at the exact time that the murder was being carried out. Cross was indeed a local man, which many experts and ripperologists believe Jack the Ripper almost certainly was. In fact, he lived only a few streets to the east of Bucks Row, and must have known the area quite well, as he worked as a carman or cart driver for Pickford's in Broad Street, 40 or so minutes to the west of Bucks Row. His place of work, Pickford's, interestingly, dealt with the delivery of meat. He wore an apron and may have had a knife on him for work purposes, and that, therefore, if he actually had blood stains on his hands or clothing, this fact would enable him to explain their presence. He certainly was present at one crime scene, but with his route to work and potentially his potential knowledge of anatomy through his employment and the possibility of his delivery routes, Cross could have been at several others. Michael Connor, in his Ripper work, Did the Ripper work for Pickford's? Suggests that Martha Tabram was murdered on a route Cross could have taken to work at a time when he was in the area. Polly Nichols was murdered along his path and he was found near her body. Annie Chapman was murdered on the same route days later. If we knew with absolute certainty what time Chapman was killed, the case for or against Cross would become clearer. The double event, the killings of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, could have been performed by Cross. The murders so far could have been done going to and from work. Does the killing of Mary Kelly fit this template, or was it an adventurous change in the killer's modus operandi? Was it a holiday treat? A man who had got away with so much may have felt like experimenting. Connors continues. 8 days after Cross was discovered with the body of Nichols, another prostitute was murdered along one of his routes at a time when he was habitually, or could have been, in the vicinity. It is not impossible that Cross arrived at Pickford's at 4 in the morning and began his workday by driving to Spitalfields Market. His wagon may have been being loaded or unloaded nearby while he dealt with Chapman. No other suspect is so strongly linked to these 3 murders. Every day other men walked these streets at similar times, but only Charles Cross was discovered beside a body. So, was Cross Jack the Ripper? As with so many of the suspects, the honest answer has to be that he might have been. However, this answer is based solely on the fact that, since we don't know who Jack the Ripper actually was, we can't dismiss or confirm any suspect with a 100% certainty. The evidence against Cross is, to say the least, circumstantial, consisting of the fact that the majority of the murders took place on his route to work. He was a local man, and that he was found at the scene of one of the murders shortly after, or even during it was interrupted.
So maybe there you have it. Jack the Ripper could have been stopped in his tracks almost before he had begun. If only the London police had thought to take a closer look at Charles Cross, the ordinary nobody who, whilst walking on his way to work throughout the early autumn mornings of 1888, couldn't resist his urge to indulge in a spot of murder and some mutilation to boot, and who blatantly lied about who he actually was. The man who committed these crimes would have been a local. He would have been able to blend into the background and walk the streets undetected. Cross was discovered standing over a body, but bizarrely no one seemed to think that this was an important fact at the time. Edward Stowe, an author who favours Cross as Jack says, the police at the time were looking for some sort of special individual. But most crimes turn out to be someone quite ordinary. Cross walked past every single murder scene on his way to work. He is the best suspect so far. Did Cross live to old age, and did he take his potential secrets of being a murderer, the infamous Jack the Ripper, to the grave? Only time will tell, but in the meantime, let there be more exciting and intriguing stories about this unsolved historical murder case. Until next time, and our next story. See you again soon.